I admire freedom fighters wherever they are, but I still believe that nonviolence is the strongest approach. I think that would apply to the Hungarian situation also. I don't think it's limited to a particular locality. I think it should apply in every situation in the world where individuals seek to break loose from the bondage of colonialism or from some totalitarian regime or from the system which we confront in America.
The Black Lives Matter protests have turned into riots. Wisconsin is burning. Another black man has been shot by white police officers. Protesters say this man, Jacob Blake, is alive, but justice is dead. George Floyd's killing seems to have changed nothing in America. Protesters are rioting. Banners are being exchanged for baseball bats. Civil disobedience is being dropped for total destruction.
Protests, satyagraha, sit-ins, marches, strikes. Nonviolent campaigns have operated under many different labels throughout the years. It seems to be an inherent social convention, a comfortable and appropriate option for the oppressed and the disenfranchised. However, we see disparity with the acceptability and success rate that these campaigns have held. Everyone knows what the March on Washington was. Everyone knows who Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi were. Everyone understands what a strike is. These modes of progression, of attempted social reform, have riddled our history as a people, as a united human race. But there remains an issue: the necessity of these movements. A culture of reform, whose inherent characteristic is that of progression and improvement, remains a constant in our lives. Why does a modality of societal improvement that has yielded fruit continue to remain necessary? Countless campaigns throughout the years have resulted in ultimately nothing, it seems. The civil rights movement brought significant strides to black liberation, yet, just a few decades later, the country is rampant with Black Lives Matter protests. The women's suffrage movement proved clear, positive change for the plight of women's status in our nation, yet the wage gap is as glaring as ever. It seems that with each step of progress, we become poisoned by latent regression. I interviewed my friend Mason Jones, a colleague of mine that I've collaborated with through Rahma, a nonprofit organization that seeks to give aid to community members through a myriad of initiatives. Mason has been involved in many Black Lives Matter protests and teachers' union protests in his home state of Wisconsin. Speaking with him gave clarity to some of these aforementioned questions while simultaneously raising others. If you could speak a little bit about what your motivation is behind being involved in these campaigns.
There's multiple reasons, right? One reason is to, obviously try to make a change, to effect a change through nonviolent means, hopefully quicker than just through lobbying alone. The political apparatus is very sluggish, very slow. And so when it comes to campaigns, when it comes to protests, a big portion of them, and the reason why they work, is because of that visibility, because of that PR, that governments at all levels can see that people are willing to come together, they're willing to risk police violence against them so that they can protest for what they believe in. If everyone decided to stay home, they never reach the critical mass needed where the people who actually have legislative power can see the numbers of people who are concerned about these issues. So big part of it is optics, and just these social justice causes are not, we're one human family. Injustice against one of us is injustice against all of us. And these protests and campaigns are good ways to demonstrate that unity and demonstrate that interconnectedness.
We're one human family. Injustice against one of us is injustice against all of us. How many of us feel this way? To what extent does inclusivity of in-groups and out-groups play a role in our awareness and involvement in the plight of those oppressed? Mason goes on to praise the fortitude of those involved in the campaigns he attended. However, these protests were far from running smoothly.
It really is a product of the people. It really is a genuine show of concern on part of the population. It's not something that's one and done. Obstacles that I'd say we faced, again, we as in a collective whole, right? Because I wasn't on any sort of organizational team, but obstacles that I think it faces are the longevity of these causes. Anyone can come to a protest one time, but to keep them going for weeks, like at least what happened in Madison, weeks, months, every single day, like that takes a collective will and just outside forces acting to kind of disrupt the protest, whether that be, police shutting them down. In the case of Black Lives Matter protests, unfortunately, you'd have militia groups come in and, threaten to do this or this action. But those are things that, unfortunately, every good cause will have someone against it. Yeah, I mean, people were scared. People were kidnapped. People were, beaten up, and people were for sure assaulted. People were, if not kidnapped, then attempted kidnappings too, because the militia groups would drive around in like vans and pickup trucks and stuff, and like people were getting pulled out of their cars and assaulted as well. And so it was crazy times. The National Guard came by for one of our protests, like with their Humvees and stuff like that, and soldiers to protect the Capitol. But that's really just a provocation for crowds. Like, what gets crowds going is the threat of violence and the threat of resistance, and that's that kind of only feeds it. So after the first night or the first couple nights, they pulled away the police, they pulled away the soldiers, and things were much calmer after that.
Nonviolent campaigns are not privy to violent resistance. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why such a disparity exists in success rates of such efforts. Notably, Gandhi had to renounce satyagraha efforts when the non-cooperation movement resulted in 22 officers being killed in 1922. How ironic that two polar ideals can be so dichotomous and yet so regularly associated with one another. In any attempt of nonviolence, violence is sure to be close by. Even more interesting is this concept of juxtaposition, how the threat of violence creates tension. Tension creates unease and restlessness, which in turn amplifies the opportunity for erratic behavior to occur. Yeah, it's good. I mean, that does sound scary. Did you see it, that kind of reception affecting kind of the motivation of those protesters? Could you see kind of them being like, this is a bit too much for me, this is a little scary, and then seeing those numbers dwindle down for future protests because of that?
No, honestly, numbers really did not trickle off too much. They were for sure not as big as they were in the beginning. Pretty much the whole way through was people from the same city who were there every single day, and really showing up and showing out for the whole thing.
That's good to hear, honestly. That kind of also solidifies some faith into the progression of us, just like as people. You know what I mean? When you're getting pushback of that nature, people getting assaulted and kidnapped, and like the National Guard and police, and just being around like guns and all this threat of like severe violence. And it's good to hear that people, like, if anything, sounded like they just remained strong or got even stronger,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, really, because the very first night of protests, a lot of windows got smashed, unfortunately. Like, it's a big square around our Capitol building, and there's this long street called State Street. And on that street, a ton of businesses were not looted so much as damaged, like windows smashed and stuff like that, which was unfortunate. But again, that damage was done by instigators, not so much by anyone involved with the protest. But when it comes to that damage, the very next day, you had people, just random people, boarding up windows, helping business owners like protect their stuff. people make the best out of the situation, and that really happened in Madison, Wisconsin. Like, they put these boards up. The whole rest of the week was spent doing like murals, like unity murals, anti-racism murals, solidarity murals over the whole street. And you can, I'm pretty sure like 80% of the city could have been walking down the street and been like, my friend painted that, or my friend's friend painted that, or that's from an organization that I know of or used to see. Like, everyone could see something of themselves on those boards and at the protests.
My next question is, what do you see as the effectiveness of protests like these? So you spoke about the teachers union, of course. Did you find that was a successful way to get reform? And I know with Black Lives Matter, it's kind of difficult to gauge, because how do you really measure racial tension, right? But just like, do you get a different kind of energy or vibe after those like Black Lives Matter protests, signifying if it was a successful movement?
So the teachers union protest was not effective, and unfortunately, but that was the handiwork of a governor who stayed in office for years and years and years, and in a state which is very heavily gerrymandered, so that it holds one particular party in power ostensibly forever. But I think they did work in pointing out, unfortunately, where we stand as a state, where we kind of stand as a nation, where, somehow our lowest priority is the education of our children. And then when you talk about Black Lives Matter, I mean, you hit it on the head. Like, you can't measure racial tensions. You can't measure the value of the life of one person over another. But I think its biggest success was pointing out that people recognize this as being a problem. I think that protest was the first time that, really, since the civil rights movement, people from all different strata and causes and faiths and walks of life kind of got together for a common problem. Like, you can't swipe it under the rug anymore. Whether it leads to meaningful, lasting legislation that won't be overturned is anybody's guess.
So where does that leave us? Is there a point in continuing campaigns in this manner, when one could argue that pursuit of this method encourages those to resist against it? One issue we need to understand is the combat of effective and ineffective attempts. Failing to gain positive results from these actions should not discourage us from enacting further attempts. On the contrary, it should push us to do it again and again and again until we see successful results. Mason brings up an interesting point. The journey of this campaigning is itself a success.
The change really has to come from within. You can't legislate anti-racism to a people. You can't legislate justice to a people. And it's going to take a societal change in values to make the real change. And I don't know what the answer is for that, but it needs to happen.
In our class specifically, we're learning about the caste system in India, and how there was some legislation against the lowest caste, and it kind of gave them some more liberties that they didn't have, but the execution of it was just insignificant. It was inefficient. People still held those prejudices and those stigmas deeply. So even though, yes, the lowest caste can now use public resources, and they can drink from public wells, and they can use public roads, they still wouldn't be able to, or they'd still be too scared to do that, because the higher caste would just be up in arms against them. You know what I mean? Like, just the energy, and then they couldn't seek much legal recourse for that. You know what I mean? So that was good. I'm really happy like you phrased it like that, because it kind of does show the universality of this mental state, right? Of how, if we're going to make significant changes, it needs to be from within, not just through laws, right? It's not so much direct significant change that these nonviolent campaigns bring about. It's more of residual change. So bringing awareness up. And I definitely notice a significant uptick in the discourse surrounding this, especially from like white people and like Americans, right? A lot of people do have these thoughts. People think, yeah, slavery is bad, but when it comes to like being forthright about talking about it or doing something about it, they don't really take that step. And I think the Black Lives movements, Black Lives Matter movements, like put that in the spotlight, right? People started talking about it. People started posting about it. Like people, it's common discourse, and then you really see where people stand on it, you know. And it's so refreshing to see that. You know what I mean? It really is refreshing.
I think you're right. It got people talking about it who before considered it not my problem. Like immigration's a Mexican problem or a Latino problem. Racism's a Black problem. You know, anti-Semitism is a Jewish problem. Islamophobia is a Muslim problem. Like everybody, and it still exists today, right? Like everyone has their in group and their out group, and but I think that these protests just showed that the winds of change are a blowing, hopefully, where we no longer view these issues as this group's problem or that group's problem. It's our problem. It's a human problem. I'm never going to have the Black experience. I'm never going to have the immigrant experience, but I can do what I can to get to know those struggles and help to remedy some of those injustices within my capacity, you know. And that's what everyone's mindset should be, to get to know where our fellow human beings are suffering so that we can help alleviate that suffering. We have to start seeing us as one human family, where if a problem affects one of us, it affects all of us. Until then, it's only half measures and stuff like that. And that's an ideal world, right? But, you know, the closer we get to that, the better things will be, inshallah.
Talking with Mason has made me ponder a lot. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps there is no solution. Will we ever reach a point where nonviolence becomes the ultimate mode of change? No, we won't. Not now, not ever. Negative qualities will always exist. Greed, elitism, selfishness, and exclusion exist now, and they existed during the time of Gandhi and Ambedkar, and will continue to exist as long as humans exist. But it's not our job to fix the world. It's not our duty to alleviate the suffering of every person, to banish every evil that exists in this world. Our duty is to do the aforementioned on a scale relative to our capability. We have the responsibility, the burden of getting involved in social reform, of joining protests. We are liable in donating money to the poor, in volunteering our time to help feed the homeless. We are required to spend our free time in the pursuit of helping others, because just in that action, just in that effort, we have succeeded.
Inshallah.
Man. Any final thoughts that you want to say about just nonviolent protests or anything in general?
Final thoughts, I would say there has to be more. You know, it can't be a once in a decade. It can't be a once or in every other generation kind of thing. It has to be going on all the time for every issue, because there's a lot of injustice out there in the world, unfortunately. There's the injustice in Palestine. There's the injustice with the Uyghurs. There's the injustice in Myanmar, in the Gulf, in North Africa, in in sub-Saharan Africa as well, with colonial structures that still exist today, and within our own nation, within our own borders. There's so much oppression that, you know, solving one issue or another, it's not going to get the job done. It has to be, you know, something that, these protests basically have to keep going on. We have to do our part to start them and sustain them, so that people can realize that the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, is one of justice. So, and one where people are not going to sit at home anymore while these injustices are happening around them. People will take to the streets. People will call all their friends and family to show up and show out for these causes, which affect all of us. So that, I think there's going to be more of that happening. But, you know, God willing, inshallah.
God willing. Yeah, and even when you were just listing out, you know, areas where, you know, oppression is kind of going rampant. And as unfortunate as it is to say it, the list goes on. The list goes
Yeah.
on and on. Just you could keep going about these people are suffering, this thing is happening, and it can get overwhelming, you know. But it's not our duty to fix everything. It's our duty to do what we can, you know. It's our duty to
Exactly.
just work within our own capacity.
Beautifully said, brother.